sun had not yet cleared the rim of the canyon when Elias pulled the first post from the stack, the wood heavy and damp with the night's dew. He was a man who moved with a slow, mechanical precision, his life measured out in the distance between one fence line and the next. 10 feet away, Sarah was already working the auger into the stubborn, sun-baked earth, her weight leaning into the iron handle as it bit into the clay. They had been working this line for 6 days, dawn until dusk, sharing nothing but the labor and the white heat of the territory. They did not speak because the work was too heavy for words and because they were both, in their own ways, simply very tired of life. Elias carried the weight of a decade spent in the saddle for companies that no longer existed, and Sarah carried the silence of a homestead that had burned to the ground 3 winters ago. They were 2 people who had run out of road at the same time and found themselves hired to string wire across a valley that seemed to have no end. The sound of the auger was a rhythmic, grinding protest against the silence of the morning. Elias watched the way the dust gathered in the creases of Sarah's shirt, a fine, gray powder that turned to a dark paste with the sweat soaked through the fabric. He did not offer to take the tool from her, and she did not ask for help. This was the agreement they had reached without ever speaking a word. They would be equal in the labor, and they would be left alone in their thoughts. Elias set the post into the hole she had finished, the sound of the wood hitting the bottom a dull, satisfying thud. He took up the rammer, a heavy iron bar, and began to pack the earth back and around the base. The movement was repetitive and meditative. Thump, thump, thump. Each strike of the iron sent a vibration up Elias's arms and into his chest, a steady pulse that seemed to sync with the beating of his heart. He focused on the texture of the soil, the way the small pebbles clattered against the wood, the way the scent of disturbed earth rose up to meet him, cool and metallic and ancient. He did not look at the horizon or the miles of wire still to be strung. He looked only at the post and the rammer and the small space of ground at his feet. Sarah moved 5 yards down the line and started the next hole. The squeak of the iron handle was the only music they had. She worked with a grim, focused intensity, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the dirt. Elias watched her occasionally, not out of curiosity, but out of a basic, animal awareness of another living thing in the waste. He saw the way she adjusted her grip, the way she wiped the sweat from her brow at the back of the gloved hand, leaving a smear of red clay across her forehead. She was a woman who had forgotten how to be soft, and Elias was a man who had forgotten how to want anything other than a meal and a place to lie down. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the canyon walls into a shimmering orange kiln. The light was absolute and unforgiving, bleaching the color out of the sagebrush and making the air vibrate with heat. Elias stopped to take a drink from the canteen, the water warm and tasting of tin. He walked over to where Sarah was working and held it out. He took it without looking at him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, a momentary friction of skin against skin, but in the vast, empty quiet of the valley, it felt like a significant event. She drank, the water spilling down her chin and soaking into the collar of her shirt, then handed it back. "Going to be a scorcher," Elias said. His voice was a low, gravelly resonance, a sound that felt like it had been pulled up from a deep well. Sarah nodded, her eyes squinting against the glare. "Always is." That was the extent of their dialogue for the morning. Elias went back to his post, and Sarah went back to her auger. The hours stretched out, measured only by the growing number of wooden stakes rising out of the ground. The shadow of the fence began to lengthen, a jagged, skeletal line that followed them across the flats. Elias found himself noticing the small things about her, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the way she favored her left knee when she stood up, the way she breathed a steady, rhythmic huffing that matched the pace of her work. He did not think of these things as beautiful or even interesting. They were simply facts, data gathered by a mind that had nothing else to process. But as the days passed, these facts began to form a map of her presence, a geography of another person that was becoming as familiar to him as the terrain. When the sun finally began to dip toward the western rim, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor, Elias called a halt. He did not say it was time to stop. He simply set the remmer down and walked toward the small camp they had established near a dry wash. Sarah followed a moment later, her movements heavy and stiff. The camp was a study in minimalism. 2 bedrolls, a small fire pit, and a single crate of supplies. Elias began the ritual of the fire, his movements practiced and slow. He gathered dried mesquite branches and arranged them in a pyramid, his fingers moving with a gentleness that seemed out of place in a man of his stature. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur and phosphorus illuminating the lines of his face, the deep-set eyes, the weathered skin, the gray in his beard. He watched the flame catch, a small, orange flickering that fought against the encroaching blue of the twilight. Sarah sat on a stone nearby, her hands resting on her knees. She watched him work. She watched the way he tended the fire, the way he placed each piece of wood as if it were a precious thing. She reached for the coffee pot, the blackened tin cold in the evening air. He poured water from the skin, the sound of clean, hollow splashing in the quiet. Elias sat back on his heels and watched her. He saw the way the firelight softened the hard lines of her face, the way it turned the red clay on her skin into a rich, earthy gold. They ate in silence beans and salt pork heated in a single pan. The only sound was the crackle of the mesquite and the rhythmic scraping of their spoons against the tin. It was a comfortable silence, a shared space where nothing was expected of them. They were too tired for the theater of conversation, too hollow for the burden of stories. They simply existed together in the small circle of light, 2 points of heat in a cold and darkening world. After the meal, Elias took up a piece of leather and a needle. He began to mend a tear in his glove, the needle passing through the tough hide with a soft, rhythmic hiss. He focused entirely on the task, his mind narrowing down to the tension of the thread and the placement of the holes. Sarah watched the rhythmic motion of his hands. It was hypnotic, a repetitive liturgy that seemed to push back the loneliness of the night. She reached for her own sewing kit, a small, battered tin, and began to mend a snag in her wool shawl. They worked side by side for an hour, the only sound the wind sighing through the sage and the occasional pop of the fire. The firelight began to fade, the orange embers pulsing like a dying heart. Elias set his glove aside and looked up at the stars. They were brilliant and cold, scattered across the black velvet of the sky like spilled salt. "My father used to say the stars were just holes in the floor of heaven," Sarah said softly. Her voice was thin and fragile in the vastness. Elias did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the sky. "A lot of holes." Yes, that was all. The conversation did not lead anywhere, and it did not need to. It was simply a thought shared, a small bridge built across the gap between them. Elias stood up and moved toward his bedroll, his boots crunching on the gravel. Sarah followed suit. They lay down a few feet apart, the fire between them. Elias lay on his back, staring up at the dark. He could hear Sarah's breathing, the slow, steady rhythm of sleep beginning to take hold. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that he was not alone in the waste. He felt a strange, tentative sense of peace, a feeling that as long as they kept building the fence, as long as they kept moving across the valley, the world could not catch them. He closed his eyes and let the silence pull him down into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning the ritual began again. The light was a pale, diffuse silver when they woke, the air sharp and smelling of frost. Elias made the coffee, the scent of it dark and welcome in the cold. They drank it in silence, the steam rising in white, fragrant plumes from their mugs. They did not look at each other, but there was a new fluidity to their movements, a shared rhythm that had not been there at the beginning. They returned to the fence line. Sarah took up the auger, and Elias took up the rammer. The work was harder today, the ground turning to rock as they moved toward the canyon wall. Sarah struggled with the tool, her shoulders shaking with the effort of driving the iron into the stone. Elias watched her for a moment, then walked over and placed his hand over hers on the handle. The contact was unexpected and profound. His hand was large and warm, his skin rough like sandpaper. Sarah froze for a heartbeat, her breath hitching in her chest. Then slowly, she let him take the weight. They worked the auger together, their bodies moving in a synchronized, rhythmic grind. The sound of the iron against the stone was louder now, a sharp, metallic shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Shared labor was enough. They moved down the line, hole after hole, their bodies coming into contact occasionally, a shoulder brushing an arm, a hand grazing a waist. Each contact was a small, silent revelation, a reminder of the physical reality of the other. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they had finished the rocky section. They sat in the shade of a large boulder to eat their midday bread. The heat was a heavy, shimmering veil over the valley, but in the shadow of the stone, it was cool and damp. Elias leaned his back against the rock and closed his eyes. He could feel Sarah's presence beside him, a quiet, grounding heat. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of awareness, a realization that he no longer thought of her as a stranger. She was the woman who worked the altar. She was the woman who mended the shawl. She was the woman who shared the coffee. Sarah looked at Elias. She saw the way the dust had settled in the lines of his neck, the way his hands rested loosely on his knees. She felt a strange, fluttering sense of safety. He had spent so long being afraid, so long waiting for the other shoe to drop, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. But here, in the middle of a valley with a man who asked for nothing, she felt the weight of her grief beginning to shift. It was not gone, but it was no longer the only thing she carried. "You're a good hand, Elias," she said. Elias opened his eyes and looked at her. He didn't smile, but his gaze was steady and kind. "You too, Sarah." They went back to work as the sun began its long descent. The shadows of the fence posts stretched out across the red earth, long and thin like the fingers of a giant. They worked until the light was gone, until the tools were too heavy to lift. When they returned to camp, the ritual was the same, but the feeling was different. Silence was no longer empty, it was full. They sat by the fire, the orange light dancing in their eyes. Elias was cleaning his knife, the whetstone making a soft, abrasive shushing sound. Sarah was brushing the dust out of her hair, the rhythmic motion of the brush a quiet, domestic music. They did not talk, but they watched each other out of the corners of their eyes. Elias noticed the way the firelight caught the gray in Sarah's hair, turning it into a shimmering silver halo. He noticed the way her hands moved with a grace that the labor had not been able to kill. He felt a surge of tenderness, a feeling so foreign to him that it made his chest ache. He wanted to reach out and touch her, to pull her into the circle of his arms and hold her until the cold went away. But he didn't. He simply kept sharpening his knife, the shushing sound of the stone, a tether to the world. Sarah felt his gaze. He felt the warmth of it, a steady, unblinking presence that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't been seen in years. She stopped brushing her hair and looked at him. "Elias?" "Yes, thank you." "For what?" "For saying." Elias set the knife aside and looked at the fire. "Nowhere else to go." "I know." The night deepened, the wind picking up and whistling through the canyon. The air grew cold, a sharp, biting chill that seeped through their clothes and into their bones. Elias moved his bedroll closer to the fire, then closer to Sarah. He didn't say anything. He simply lay down, his back to the wind, creating a shelter for her. Sarah lay down beside him, her back to the fire. You could feel the heat of his body, a solid, unmoving wall of warmth. She closed her eyes and let her head rest against the small of his back. The contact was a shock of comfort, a grounding reality that made the darkness feel less absolute. She felt Elias go still, his breathing hitching for a second before settling into a deep, steady rhythm. They lay like that for a long time, two people huddled together against the vast, indifferent dark. The fire burned down to embers, the orange light fading into a deep, pulsing red. The wind howled and the stars turned, but in the small circle of the camp, there was only the warmth of the other and the rhythmic sound of their breathing. The days turned into weeks. The fence line grew longer, a wooden spine that divided the valley into two. They moved through the landscape like a single organism, their movements synchronized, their needs anticipated. Elias knew when Sarah needed a drink of water before she did. Sarah knew when Elias's back was aching and would adjust the pace of the work to compensate. The love grew between them not out of words or grand gestures, but out of the mundane reality of the shared life. It was in the way Elias would sharpen her auger every evening. It was in the way Sarah would save the best piece of pork for his plate. It was in the way they stood together on the ridge, watching the sunset, their shoulders touching, their eyes fixed on the same horizon. They were still tired, still hollowed out by the lives they had lived, but the emptiness was being filled by the quiet presence of the other. They were no longer two people fleeing the past. They were two people building a future, one fence post at a time. The valley was changing too. The summer was giving way to autumn, the air growing crisp and the sage brush turning a deep, dusty purple. The light was softer now, a golden, nostalgic glow that made the canyon walls look like they were made of honey. They were nearing the end of the line, the place where the fence would meet the creek and the contract would be finished. Elias felt a sense of dread as they approached the final post. He didn't want the work to end. He didn't want the routine to break. He was afraid that once the fence was finished, the silence would return, and Sarah would walk away into the waste. He didn't know how to ask her to stay. He didn't have a house to offer her, or a life that wasn't made of dust and wire. Sarah felt the same fear. She watched the way Elias worked the rammer, the muscles in his back bunching under his shirt. She thought of the long, lonely miles she had traveled before she found him. She thought of the way her heart had felt like a piece of cold iron, and how it had begun to thaw in the heat of the canyon. She wanted to tell him that she didn't care about the house or the life. She only cared about the man. But they didn't speak. They kept building the fence. The final day arrived. The light was a brilliant, blinding white when they woke, the sky a cloudless, infinite blue. They reached the creek by noon, the water a clear, bubbling thread that ran through the rocks. Final post sat on the bank, a heavy, weathered beam of cedar. Elias set the post into the hole Sarah had dug. He took up the rammer and began to pack the earth. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was a finality, a closing of a chapter. He worked until the post was as solid as the stone beneath it. Then he set the iron bar down and looked at the fence. It was a good fence. It was straight and strong, a testament to the weeks of labor. It stretched back across the valley, a wooden line that disappeared into the heat haze. Elias looked at Sarah. She was standing by the creek, her hands resting on her hips, her eyes fixed on the water. "It's done," Elias said. Sarah nodded, her gaze not leaving the stream. "Yes, it's done." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the bubbling of the creek and the distant cry of a hawk. The silence was heavy and thick, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Elias felt the words gathering in his chest, a desperate, clumsy plea that he couldn't find the breath to speak. Sarah turned and looked at him. Her eyes were full of a quiet, wondering recognition. She saw the man who had stayed. She saw the man who had mended the glove and built the fire and held the silence. She saw the man she loved. She walked over to him and reached out, her hand finding his. Her fingers were small and warm, closing around his calloused palm with a firm, certain pressure. Elias looked down at their joined hands. He felt a surge of peace so profound it made his head swim. "What now, Elias?" he asked softly. Elias looked at the valley, then back at the woman. He squeezed her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "I reckon there's another line needs stringing over in the next basin." "I reckon there is. You want to go see?" "I do." That was all. No grand declarations, no promises of forever. Just a decision to keep moving together. They loaded the wagon in silence, their movements hushed and efficient. They moved with a lightness that had not been there at the beginning, a sense of purpose that made the heavy crates feel like nothing. They drove the wagon out of the canyon and across the valley. The fence they had built a wooden spine at their backs. The sun was setting, the sky a violent, beautiful explosion of orange and purple. They sat on the bench seat, their shoulders touching, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They traveled for days, moving deeper into the high desert. The routine was the same: the morning coffee, the daily labor, the evening fire, but the feeling was entirely different. They were no longer tired of life. They were simply living it. The autumn deepened, the nights growing colder and the days shorter. They reached the next basin and found the work waiting for them. It was a vast, empty expanse of sagebrush and rock, a place that would take months to fence. They set up their camp near a small spring and began the ritual of the line. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, a fine, dry powder that hissed against the canvas of the wagon, they sat by the fire. Elias was cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic sound of the oilcloth against the steel a familiar pulse in the room. Sarah was mending a wool blanket, her needle moving in and out with a soft, rhythmic kiss. The silence was profound, a deep and resonant peace that filled the space. Elias looked at Sarah, her head bowed over her work, the firelight catching the silver in her hair. He felt a surge of gratitude so strong it made his eyes sting. He realized that he was no longer a man who was running. He was a man who had arrived. He reached out and covered her hand with his palm broad and warm. She didn't pull away. She interlaced her fingers with his, her skin soft against his calloused palm. They sat in the silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, two people who had found their way through the waste. The night deepened, the silence becoming absolute. Outside, the world was a vast, white emptiness. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar and coffee. Elias felt the weight of Sarah's head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and steady as she drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep beside him. He didn't move his arm. He stayed exactly where he was, his back against the wagon wheel, his heart quiet. The journey was not over, but the road was no longer lonely. The fire gave one last, soft pop and settled into gray ash. The two of them sat unmoving in the shadows, two souls finally resting in the same place. Elias reached out with his free hand and pulled the heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, his movements hushed and careful. She stirred slightly in her sleep, her fingers tightening just a fraction more around his hand. She did not wake, but she held on, her grip firm and certain. Elias looked at her hand, the small, pale fingers against his dark, weathered skin. He didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching the shadows on the canvas, content in the simple, heavy reality of the present. The morning would bring the frost and the auger and the long, slow work of the fence. But for now, There was only the dark, the warmth, and the quiet proximity of the other. Elias closed his eyes and let the silence pull him toward a deep, dreamless sleep, his heart finally at rest. The valley was wide and the work was hard, but the silence was enough. They stayed. They didn't move. The snow continued to fall. The stars moved across the sky, and in the morning they would start the next hole together. The end of the day was always the best. The light would fade, and the heat would break, and they would sit by the fire and watch the world go dark. There was a comfort in the repetition, a safety in the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly like today. Elias adjusted the blanket one last time, his hand lingering for a moment against Sarah's hair. It was a small, silent gesture, a promise made in the dark. He stayed, and the world was quiet. The rhythm of the work had become a language of its own. When Elias picked up the rammer, Sarah knew to move the water skin. When Sarah began to sharpen the auger, Elias knew to gather more wood for the evening fire. They functioned with a seamless efficiency that required no verbal cues, a physical dialogue that was more honest than anything they could have said. The autumn turned to a true biting winter. The ground froze hard, and the work became a brutal contest against the elements. Each hole took twice as long to dig, each post twice as long to set. They moved slower now, their bodies wrapped in layers of wool and leather, their faces hidden behind scarves and hats. But they didn't stop. They kept building the fence, moving across the white, frozen basin like two dark ghosts. The isolation was total. They hadn't seen another person in months. The world had shrunk to the size of their camp and the length of the fence line. But strangely, they didn't feel lonely. The presence of the other was a constant, solid fact that filled the void. Elias found himself watching the way Sarah handled the cold. He didn't complain, didn't slow down. He simply pulled her coat tighter and kept working the auger. There was a strength in her that he found humbling, a quiet, stubborn resilience that made him want to be a better man. He found himself doing small things to make her life easier, heating her boots by the fire in the morning, mending her gloves before she could even ask. Sarah noticed these things. He noticed the way Elias would always take the windward side of the work, his large body acting as a shield for her. She noticed the way he would save the warmest blanket for her, even when the frost was thick on his own bedroll. She felt a deep, quiet gratitude for him, a feeling that was settling into something more permanent. One evening, they were forced to take shelter in the wagon as a blizzard swept through the basin. The wind was a screaming, white fury that shook the heavy vehicle and threatened to tear the canvas cover to shreds. Inside, the space was cramped and dark, lit only by a single lantern hanging from the center rib. They sat on the floorboards, wrapped in blankets, listening to the roar of the storm. The air was freezing, their breath coming in white, misty clouds. Elias reached out and took Sarah's hands in his large palms covering her cold fingers. "Going to be a long night," he said softly. Sarah nodded, her teeth chattering slightly. "I've seen worse." "I reckon you have." Elias pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. She could hear the steady, powerful thrum of his heart, a rhythmic pulse that was louder than the wind. She felt a sense of absolute safety. The storm could howl all it wanted. The world could turn into a white wasteland, but as long as she was in this man's arms, nothing could touch her. They stayed like that for hours, huddled together in the dark. They didn't talk about the storm or the fence or the future. They simply existed in the warmth of the shared space. Elias felt the softness of her hair against his chin, the weight of her body against his. He felt a peace so profound it was almost like a physical sensation, a settling of his soul that he hadn't known was possible. Eventually, the wind began to die down. the scream of the storm fading into a low, mournful moan. The snow stopped hissing against the canvas. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, the silence of a world buried in white. Elias looked at Sarah. She had fallen asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light of the lantern. He didn't move. He didn't want to break the moment. He stayed exactly where he was, holding her, listening to the silence. He realized then that the fence didn't matter. The basin didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the woman in his arms, and the quiet proximity they had built out of the dust and the cold. He was no longer tired of life. He was ready for whatever came next, as long as he didn't have to face it alone. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the basin into a brilliant, blinding world of white. The snow was deep, reaching up to the hubs of the wagon wheels. Elias stepped out into the crisp, cold air, his boots sinking into the powder. The world was beautiful and silent, a clean slate. He began the slow work of digging out the wagon and the tools. Sarah joined him a few minutes later, her movements hushed. They didn't talk, but there was a new lightness to their actions, a shared understanding that the worst was over. They spent the day clearing the camp and checking on the mules. The work was hard and cold, but they moved with a fluid, synchronized grace. They were a team, a single unit moving through the landscape. As the sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, they sat by the fire. Elias was cleaning the auger. The rhythmic sound of the rag against the iron had a familiar music. Sarah was cooking a pot of stew, the scent of it warm and savory in the cold air. They sat in the silence, watching the stars appear. The sky was clear and vast, the stars brilliant and cold. Elias looked at Sarah and felt a surge of love so strong it made his eyes sting. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "Sarah," he said softly. He looked at him, her eyes clear and calm. "Yes, Elias, I reckon we've got enough wire for the whole valley. I reckon we do. And I reckon I'd like to be the one stringing it with you." Sarah didn't answer with words. He simply squeezed his hand, a firm, certain pressure. He leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. They sat in the silence for a long time, two people who had found their home in the middle of a wasteland. The journey wasn't over, and the work would always be hard, but the road was no longer lonely. Fire gave one last soft pop and settled into gray ash. The two of them sat unmoving in the shadows, two souls finally resting in the same place. Elias reached out with his free hand and pulled the heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, his movements hushed and careful. She stirred slightly in her sleep, her fingers tightening just a fraction more around his hand. She did not wake, but she held on, her grip firm and certain. Elias looked at her hand, the small, pale fingers against his dark, weathered skin. He didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching the shadows on the snow, content in the simple, heavy reality of the present. The morning would bring the frost and the work and the long, slow journey across the basin. But for now, there was only the dark, the warmth, and the quiet proximity of the other. Elias closed his eyes and let the silence pull him toward a deep, dreamless sleep, his heart finally at rest. The valley was wide and the road was long, but the silence was enough. He stayed, and the world was quiet. The rhythm of the work continued. They moved across the basin, one post at a time, one day at a time. The winter began to break, the snow melting into a thick, red mud that made the work even harder. But they didn't care. They kept moving, their bodies synchronized, their hearts quiet. They reached the end of the basin in the early spring, when the first green shoots were beginning to push through the damp earth. The fence was finished, a long wooden spine that stretched back across the waste. They stood on the ridge, looking back at the work they had done. "It's a good fence, Elias," Sarah said softly. "It is. What now?" Elias looked at the horizon, where the mountains rose up like jagged, purple ghosts. He squeezed her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "I reckon there's a valley on the other side of those mountains needs a bit of wire. I reckon there is. You want to go see?" "I do." They loaded the wagon and drove away into the spring light. The fence they had built a wooden line at their backs. They moved with a lightness and a purpose that had not been there at the beginning. They were no longer two tired souls. They were two people living their lives one day at a time together. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was a shared space, a home they carried with them wherever they went. And as long as they had each other, the silence was enough. They traveled for days, the landscape changing from the red rock of the desert to the green hills of the foothills. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and rain. They found a new valley, a wide, fertile expanse that looked like it had never known a fence. They set up their camp near a clear, bubbling creek and began the ritual of the line. The work was the same, but the feeling was different. They were home. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden, honeyed light over the valley, they sat by the fire. Elias was cleaning the auger, the rhythmic sound of the rag against the iron of familiar music. Sarah was mending the shawl, her needle moving in and out with a soft, rhythmic hiss. The silence was profound, a deep and resonant peace. Elias looked at Sarah and felt a surge of love so strong it made his chest ache. He reached out and covered her hand with his palm broad and warm. He didn't pull away. He interlaced her fingers with his, her skin soft against his calloused palm. They sat in the silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, two people who had found their way through the waste. The night deepened, the silence becoming absolute. Outside, the world was a vast, green emptiness. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar and rain. Elias felt the weight of Sarah's head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and steady as she drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep beside him. He didn't move his arm. He stayed exactly where he was, his back against the wagon wheel, his heart quiet. The journey wasn't over, but the road was no longer lonely. Fire gave one last, soft pop and settled into gray ash. The two of them sat unmoving in the shadows, two souls finally resting in the same place. He stayed, and the world was quiet. He stayed. He didn't move. The creek flowed on. The stars moved across the sky. In the morning, they would start the next hole. Together, the silence was a home, and they were finally there. Elias leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He could feel the warmth of the woman beside him, the steady, rhythmic draw of her breath. He felt a peace that was so absolute it was almost like a physical sensation. He was no longer running. He was home.